Welcome to qiphyedu. Today we'll be looking at Economics Paper 1. Specifically, this is the Specimen paper for examination from 2023. So this means that this entire paper is based off of the new syllabus. So it's slightly different from the previous past year papers that we have done on this channel. All right, so let's get started. Okay, first question, the demand for a product is inversely related to its price, ceteris paribus. And what does ceteris paribus mean in this context? Okay, ceteris paribus is basically when one item is a variable, but others are held constant. That means that in one condition, an item will change, will affect something else, but all the others would not actually change it. It will remain constant, like it's the same. We only can like have one thing that will become the variable, but all the others would not actually change it, because in one context we are only looking at specifically one thing to the other. We're not really taking, we are not really looking at all the other factors that are going to affect anything else. So everything else will remain constant when it comes to economics. So here you can see it says that the demand for product is inversely related to price. So that will be our main points here, demand and price. So demand is affected by its price. So let's take a look from D to A. I'm going to look from the bottom to the top. Right, price falls result in increased quantity demanded. We are looking at the context of ceteris paribus, the meaning of it, so D is not correct. The price changes result from changes in demand is not correct. The factors affecting price other than demand are held constant is wrong, because we are talking about demand and it's affected by price. So it's not the factors that are affecting price, but it's the factors that are affecting demand, right? So the thing here that we can see that it's affecting demand is actually the price, right? So A will be the most correct, because factors affecting demand other than price are held constant. All right, so A. And question 2, what is likely to be introduced in the market for bus travel if an economy moves from a mixed economy to a market economy? So the main point here will be from a mixed economy to a market economy. A mixed economy is when goods are allocated by both the price mechanism and market forces, while some goods are actually provided directly by the public sector. For example, public goods and merit goods are provided by the public sector, and private goods are provided by the private sector. So if let's say in this mixed economy move to a market economy, that means that there will be a missing market for public goods and merit goods, and everything that is allocated is just basically based off of private goods in general. So if we look from D to A, subsidies to bus operators is a form of government intervention, and because it is in a market economy, that means that there's basically little to no government intervention. Because the public sector, when it comes to public sectors, mostly we're talking about GLCs or government-based companies or government-linked companies, and basically in a market economy, it's mostly based off of private sectors. So D is not correct. Maximum prices for bus travel is a form of price control, which is also a form of government intervention, so it's not correct. Free bus travel for school children is basically direct provision, so providing the school children directly with free bus travel through taxes collected by the government from employed people. So B is also not correct, and A would be the most correct one, because allowing companies to bid for bus routes is basically what will happen in a market economy. Okay, 3. The diagram shows that the PPC of maize and beans has changed from PPC 1 to PPC 2, and what has happened to the opportunity cost of maize and the returns to factors producing beans. Okay, so initially, if you can see here, since the output of maize is 100, and then the output of beans is 0, if you look at the straight graph here, I'm just going to draw something like this. I'm just going to write like a horizontal line and also a vertical line. Now, if you see here, if let's say I were to draw a longer line for PPC2, it will look something like this, right? And then you see that we are now looking at the opportunity cost of maize and the returns to factors producing beans. So instead of producing only 100 beans, now the PPC has shifted to the point where you can produce more of beans in general. So 200 tons of beans would equal to 0 output of maize. Before this, it was only 100 tons of maize. So the returns to factors of producing beans would have risen. So A and B is wrong. A and C is wrong, not B. So that will be left us with either B and D. The opportunity cost of maize has increased because if you look here, now if you were to produce more of maize, you end up producing you can technically produce more of beans, but now you end up just choosing to produce more maize. So the opportunity cost would have increased because the resources could have been used for something else, could be used for beans instead. So both of these opportunity costs and returns to factors have risen, so answer is B. Okay, 4. An individual buys a ticket to visit a government-owned art gallery. So the main point here will be buying ticket and also government-owned art gallery. And how would this visit be classified by economists? Okay, an art gallery is a very good because you can get to see art, you can learn about art, but it's excludable, and it's also it possesses characteristics of being a rivalry product, and then people can be excluded, and it also requires use of scarce resources to produce the art gallery, and then the individual buys a ticket. So definitely it's not a public good because it's not free, you need to pay for it. So C and D is wrong. If you look at A and B, A, it says that it's a private and demerit good. So this is not a demerit good because it is owned by the government. The government itself is owning this property. So A is not correct. Answer is B. Okay. In question 5, diagram shows a shift in the firm supply curve from S1 to S2. So you can see that it shifts from S1 to S2, which means that there is an increase in the cost of production. Because in a leftward shift, in a leftwards shift, you'll see that what consequences would be an increase in price of that particular product. So what may have caused the shift from S1 to S2? Let's look at the 4 choices. So A, a decrease in the cost of production of firm is definitely wrong, because if there's a decrease in the cost of production, the supply curve will shift to the right. But here the supply curve shifts to the left, so A is wrong. And B, a decrease in the popularity of the firm's product is when the demand curve shifts to the left. Because normally if there's a decrease in popularity, that will only affect the demand and not the supply. So B is not correct because there's no demand curve whatsoever. And C, a decrease in the subsidy of good will increase the cost of production, so this is correct. But let's take a look at D and see if it's correct or not. A decrease in the tax of the good will then decrease the cost of production and it will shift the supply curve to the right, so D is also wrong. So answer is C. Okay, question 6. What is not an example of the role of the factor enterprise in the modern economy? So factor enterprise. The main aim of an enterprise is to maximize profit. Right? So A, deciding on new export markets for the firm's goods and services will help to increase profits if it's profitable. If let's say the good itself in that market is depending on whether it's elastic or inelastic, right? So finding new markets to sell your products, and probably there'll be increasing demand, right? So A is correct. And B, making payments to suppliers for raw materials and capital goods is not a role of factor enterprise, because like I said, here we are trying to maximize profits, right? So making payments is not the role of a factor enterprise in this context. C, reducing costs through the introduction of a new shift system would indeed maximize profit. This is correct. And D, transforming the production process with the introduction of technological improvements would also maximize profit. So wrong answer here would be B. 7, a manufacturer increases the price of a product from $4 in an attempt to increase total expenditure on the product, and the table shows the outcome of the policy. So initially at $4, the total expenditure is $400,000. We could technically just find the quantity demanded by dividing total expenditure with price. So 400,000 divided by 4 we get 100,000. 500,000 divided by 5 we get 100,000, and 600,000 divided by 6 we get 100,000. That means that QD remains the same. There's no change, so it's 0. The PED is 0. So it's perfectly inelastic. So A is not correct, B is correct, C and D is wrong. So answer is B. Right, number 8. A firm established that the price elasticity of supply has a value of 0.3. That means it's inelastic. So what is likely to be true? So A, it has unused productive capacity. This is wrong, because if there's unused productive capacity, that means that it's elastic. And B, it has a lot of stock in its product. It's wrong as well, because if the product can be stored for quite a long time, then it's very easy for the suppliers to actually respond to the changes in price. But unfortunately, in this case, no. And C, it uses a high proportion of perishable raw materials. This one is correct, because if let's say you use a high proportion of perishable raw materials, this means that your product itself can only last for maybe 1 week or 2 weeks, and it's very difficult to stock up supplies that can only last for this long, right? So it's inelastic because of this. And D, it uses factors of production that easily substituted. This is also not correct, because if you use factors of production that are easily substituted, that means that you can easily switch over in the event that your price decreases, and then you can use other raw materials to actually help to boost your production. So in this context, that means that it's elastic, but it's definitely not. So answer is C. Okay, 9. The diagram shows the market for oil. The original equilibrium price is P. So you can see that P would be around here. And then there's a reduction in world oil supplies due to war in some supplying countries. So reduction in supply. And some importing countries are much colder than usual. So oil, you need oil to actually make fire, right? So that means the demand will have increased if it's cold, because you want to make it hot. You need to set up a fire. You want it to be hot, right? So reduction in world oil supplies, decreased supply. And then some importing countries are much colder, so increased demand. So we end up having the supply curve at S1 and then the demand curve at D1. So now the price is at P4. Okay, question 10. The demand for a good falls at the same time as its cost of production decrease, and what would be the combined effect of these changes on the price and on the quantity supply of the good? So the demand for a good falls, assuming that we have a demand and supply curve, this one will be the supply curve, this will be a demand curve. Demand for a good falls, so you shift to the left, and the cost of production decrease, so you shift to the right, supply curve. So definitely the price has decreased, as you can see. Originally the price should be somewhere around here. But then the quantity is uncertain on whether or not it's increased or decreased. It could be the same. It could have increased. It could have decreased. But then, because of the way the graph is structured, it's actually very difficult to know whether or not it has increased or remained the same. So C and D is wrong because price is definitely decreased. But then quantity supply has not decreased because there are many possibilities, because we don't know to what degree has the cost of production decreased and to what degree the demand has fallen. But definitely we know that if, let's say, there's both a shift in the supply curve to the right and a shift of the demand curve to the left, definitely the price will decrease. But then quantity supply is definitely uncertain, so answer is B. All right, and then for question 11, a government imposes a specific indirect tax. And when will the tax cause the greatest reduction in consumer surplus for the buyers of products? Right, so this one, we can actually just draw it out and then we roughly know which one is which. When a product has price elastic demand and price elastic supply, so it'll be something like this. So let's say the government imposes a specific indirect tax. That means that the supply curve will shift to the left, right? And then you see that the consumer surplus has decreased, but not by a great margin. And then let's say if it's a price elastic demand and price elastic supply, so it'll be something like this. All right, it's quite obvious. And then let's say I shift it to the left. So you see that the shift is also insignificant. So you can see that it's really insignificant. And then for C, when the product has price inelastic demand, so that would be something like this, and then price elastic supply, which is like this. So now we can shift to the left. So you can see that the decrease in price is more obvious, but it's still not very, well, I'm just let's just look at D first, and then we'll decide on which one will be the one with the highest impact. And D, and the product has price inelastic demand and price inelastic supply, so it'll be something like this. Right, so shift to left, and then you look like this. But then here in this context, definitely when it comes, if it's for looking at this context, A and B is definitely wrong. And then for C and D, when the product has price elastic demand and price elastic supply, the reason why when there's a price, if the price elasticity of supply is actually elastic, it will actually result in a greater reduction, is because if you actually compare these two graphs, you'll realize that the area for D and C, the C area is much larger, but the area for D is actually much smaller. So the one that is correct would be C, because if there's an increase in price, the suppliers will be able to adjust accordingly. But then if it's price elastic demand, that means that consumers will buy whatever the price is, right? So the area for that will be relatively larger because they have a greater reduction in price overall, right? And then for question 12, table shows the maximum amount 3 students would each be willing to pay for a taxi to take them home from a nightclub. So we have Jane with $10 and Sarah with $8 and Yasmin at $6. The fare for the taxi is $12, so I'm going to divide it by 3. So that means each person pays $4. Assume that they share the same taxi fare. They share the taxi fare, and which row shows how much they should pay so that they each obtain the same consumer surplus. So Jane can pay $10 at max, but then the fare is only $4, so we do minus 4, we get 6. 8 minus 4 for Sarah, we get 4. Yasmin will be 6 minus 4, and then we get 2. So ABC is all wrong. Answer is D. Right? And then 13. The government fixes a minimum price for a service, and what will be the outcome of such a policy? So a minimum price would be price control, and in order for it to be effective, it must be priced above the equilibrium price. So 13, let's look at A. The amount of 4 of the minimum price is below the equilibrium price. Wrong. If it's below the equilibrium price, the suppliers will still sell at the equilibrium price. They won't bother with actually selling at the minimum price because no supplier wants to reduce their profits. Okay. And B, demand will rise if the minimum price is above the equilibrium price. No, demand will decrease. And then C, production of 4 in minimum price is above the equilibrium price. This is wrong because supply will increase, as you can see. Supply has moved to the right, so C is wrong. So answer is D. Production will stay the same if minimum price is below the equilibrium price because suppliers will still sell at the equilibrium price. Okay, 14. The diagram illustrates the effects of placing a specific indirect tax equal to JM on a good, and which area represents total tax receipts. So now the supply curve has shifted from S1 to S2, and then here at S2, I'm gonna just draw Q1 and Q2 so it's easier to see. So originally at S1, the quantity is at Q2. However, after the supply curve shift to S2, the quantity is at Q1. So in order to calculate the tax receipt, we need to calculate it based on the total quantity at the same quantity for both the price at S1 and S2, at X or Z, and then calculate the total area. So that will be X, J, M, Z. So answer is D. This entire thing, because it's something like this. That will be the difference between the price after tax and the price before tax. All right. And then for question 15, the diagram shows the demand curve D1 and supply curve S1 for good. The government decides to pay producers a specific subsidy tax, specific subsidy for each unit supply, so supply curve shifts to the right. And which curve shows the new effective demand or supply curve? That would be S2. Okay, so 15B. And then 16, planned government expenditure for a country in the fiscal year 2016 is estimated at 760 billion. The top 5 areas of expenditure are given in the table. So which one would be the transfer payments? Pension is a form of transfer payment because you need to pay these pensions to people who have retired from like government service. Healthcare is not a transfer payment because you build hospitals, so production takes place. Because healthcare takes place, and then welfare would be under transfer payments because you are giving out money to people who are extremely poor, right? And then education production takes place because you hire teachers and all those, they teach students, so this one is not a form of transfer payment. Defense is not a form of transfer payment either because you're paying a salary to soldiers. So 153 plus 111, we get 264, so answer is C. In question 17, the diagram shows a shift in the AD curve from AD1 to AD2, and what might have caused this shift. So let's say there's a fall in the budget surplus. This means that, the budget surplus itself means that there's revenue more than expenditure. So when there's a fall in the budget surplus, this means the expenditure will be would increase, right? And then your revenue may decrease. So this one is correct, but let's take a look at DCD. A fall in the trade surplus basically means that normally for trade surplus, that means your inflow will be more than your outflow. Your inflow will be more than your outflow. But then in this case, if let's say your outflow is more than your inflow, this means that that means that now you're buying more inputs, and then your basically your domestic domestic consumption would now decrease. So your CIG and your X minus M will all decrease. So instead of actually shifting the AD curve to the right, it now actually supposedly should have been to the left. So B is not correct. And then C, a rise in imports would decrease the aggregate demand. It will not shift to the right because a rise in imports, like what I mentioned, you are not buying more of domestic goods, right? And then D, a rise in interest rate will decrease AD as well. So D is not correct. So answer is A. Okay, question 18, the diagram shows the change in economies with inflation. So you can see that on the first year, the inflation rate increases. Second year, the inflation rate is constant. Third year, the inflation rate decreases. And the fourth year, the inflation rate is negative. So what happens to the general price level over the 4 years? For year 1, year 2, and year 3, all of them have increased. So A and B is not correct. It's either C or D. Now for year 4, it says that for C, it says at year 4, the inflation rate is constant. However, you can see that it's a negative inflation rate. So definitely the general price level has decreased. So the answer is D. Question 19, the diagram shows the SRAS curve of an economy at which equilibrium level of the national income is a reduction in the rate of interest likely to cause the greatest inflationary increase. So I'm just going to draw every single AD curve, and then we roughly can see what's going to happen afterwards. So you can see that at first the SRAS curve is a horizontal line, and later on it curves all the way to a vertical line. So as you can see, if let's say there's a reduction in rate of interest, that means that you can see that the difference between the price level before the reduction and after the reduction is greater when it's at D. Because you can see that from A to B, it's actually just a significant, it's not really a significant increase in price level. And then for D, if let's say I were to shift the AD curve to the right, you see that the price level has increased substantially. So the one with the greatest inflationary increase would be D, because as you can see, as the SRS curve reaches reaches at a really vertical level, the price level will increase at a very steep level as well. It's like you walk up a mountain, and then the slope gets steeper and steeper, and it's basically that you can easily get to the top easier, but then at the same time you're actually using up more energy, because if you were to use like a very flat or very a slope that's not really steep, it's easier for you to walk, but at the same time it's not really easy for you to get to the peak, right? That kind of analogy. All right. And then for question 20, a large coal mine is forced to close because of falling demand for coal as consumers switch to less polluting fuels. The government organizes retraining courses. All right. The main point here will be these two, and also the fact that the coal mine has to close. So what type of unemployment is the government trying to reduce? Cyclical unemployment is when there's an economic recession. Only then there'll be unemployment. But in this case, the reason why the coal mine is forced to close is because there's falling demand, not because consumers do not want to buy it due to the fact that the economy is in a recession. So A is not correct. B is not correct because the coal mine is not closed because of seasonal reasons. It's not because the product itself cannot be produced during the summer, winter, autumn. It's just that the demand for it has decreased. So B is not correct. C will be correct because structural unemployment is when there's a change in technological processes or change in products for a consumer, but consumers may want to switch from one product to the other. So C is correct. And there's no such thing as technological unemployment, so D is not correct. So answer is C. Right. Question 21: a government succeeds in changing a current account deficit into a current account surplus. And why might this current account surplus increase the country's inflation rate? A current account surplus, a deficit, is when your outflow is more than your inflow. And then for current account surplus is when your inflow is more than your outflow. So why might it increase the country's inflation rate? So your inflow is more than your outflow, so your CIGX minus M has increased, so A is correct. But let's take a look at BCD. When your inflow is more than your outflow, it decreases production costs, all right? Because now you have your inflow of money is more than the outflow, so you hold more of the supply itself, all right? So your production costs will technically decrease. This is not correct. And C, the exchange rate should have increased because of the increase in money supply in the country. So C is not correct. And D is also not correct because, like I said, the money supply has increased. More money is sent inside the country. So this is the complete opposite. So D is not correct. So answer is A. And then when you increase aggregate demand, your price level increases, which in turn increases the country's inflation rate. So that's why A is the most accurate answer here. Right, 22, you see the government's expenditure, I should say the budget. You see that for budget, in 2008, it's in the surplus, but in 2009, 2010, it's in a deficit. So what can be concluded from the diagram? A budget deficit was replaced by budget surplus? Not correct. It's a budget surplus to a budget deficit because it's like this, and these two countries would be in these 2 years would be in a deficit. And B, a budget deficit has increased. This is correct. But let's take a look at C and D. The economy moved from a point within its PPC to a point on it, which is not correct because the economy technically supposedly they are on a point on the PPC, but now your revenue is less than your expenditure, so technically it's the opposite, right? Rather than moving from a point within this PPC to a point on it, it supposedly should be from a point on the PPC to a point within the PPC. So C is not correct. And D is also not correct, because if the yield from taxation continuously increase, the revenue would have been more than the expenditure. Because when there's an increase in taxation, there will be less expenditure by consumers. So D is not correct. Answer is B. K23, in recent years, an economy has experienced changes in its price level as shown. So price level in 2010 is at 6%, but then sometime before 2015, the price level is basically at a negative. It's actually changing, but it's the opposite around, meaning that there's a decrease in the price level. So which government policy is the most effective in reversing this trend, which is like something like this, increase from decreasing to increasing the price level, right? So A, encourage firms to expand production through tax incentives, which is not correct, because if you were to encourage firms to expand production, it will actually result in an increase in the AES curve, shift the AES curve to the right, decreasing the price level. So that's not correct. And B, introduce an incomes policy to directly control wage increase is also not correct, because your AS would not shift to the left, because normally when the AS shifts to the left, this is when your cost of production increases and your wage rises above rate inflation. But now you control wage increases, meaning that your AS will not shift to the left. So B is not correct. And C, promote household savings by advertising savings schemes would result in a decrease in AD, so this will decrease the price level, so C is wrong. But D, by reducing interest rates and increasing money supply, this will result in your AD curve to shift to the right. So when your AD curve shifts to the right, the price level increases, so answer is D. So the trend will reverse like that, from negative 2% like what I've shown here, all the way to like 6%. 24, the diagram shows Greece's trade position with the EU and Russia between 2005 and 2014, and what can be concluded about the period 2005 to 2014. So you can see that for gig trade, at around 36 billion in 2005, that will be your imports from EU. It increases, and then it decreases, and then increases again. And then for exports to EU, it's lower than your imports from EU. So that means that the Greece annual trade deficit with the EU is basically present. And the same goes for Russia as well, because Russia, you can see the imports is actually higher than your exports. So Greece is basically in a trade deficit with both these countries, both EU, which is basically a continent, and also Russia itself, which is basically a country. And then, so let's take a look at A to D and see which one is correct. So A, Greece's annual trade deficit with the EU rose continuously. It rose until 2008, and then it decreased, and then increased again. So A is not correct. Then B, Greece's annual trade deficit with the EU was lower in 2014 than in 2005, which is correct, because you can see that for 2014, the trade deficit with EU for Greece is actually only about 31 or 32 billion, but in 2005 it's somewhere around 36 or 35 billion. So this is correct. Let's take a look at C and D. Greece's annual trade deficit with the EU fell continuously, which is wrong, because like I shown in the graph, it's actually increased and decreased. And then D, Greece's annual trade deficit with the EU was smaller than its deficit with Russia. Wrong, because the annual trade deficit with the EU is larger than the deficit with Russia, as you can see from the graph. The imports from Russia is only about 10 to somewhere around 20 billion at max. But then for the EU is almost about 51 or 52 or probably even 53 billion at its peak. So D is not correct. So answer is B. Okay. Question 25, there's a rise in the exchange rate of the US dollar, and what would cause the greatest increase in the US current account deficit, which basically means your outflow more than inflow. So when there's a rise in the exchange rate of the US, raw materials that are being imported into the country will now be relatively cheaper. So for 25, a high level of domestic unemployment will not cause the greatest increase in the current account deficit, because when there's an unemployment, basically now more people would not be purchasing imported goods and all those, and also your productive capacity will decrease, your AS will decrease. So this will not cause the greatest increase in the current account deficit. And B, a high price elastic demand for imports, definitely this would increase imports, because when there's a rise in exchange rate, now it's relatively cheaper to buy things from outside, right? So in this case, more people will be inclined to buying imports because of the cheaper prices. So the quantity demanded will increase substantially. So B would result in more outflow than inflow. And C, a low price elasticity of demand for exports is not correct, because if let's say there's a low price elasticity of demand for exports, that means that even though there's a slight increase in prices, because now it's relatively more expensive to export, and then when there's low price elasticity, your total revenue will actually increase, so your inflow will actually be higher than your outflow. So C is not correct. And D, a low rate of domestic inflation will not result in the greatest increase in US current account deficit, because a low rate of domestic inflation, a low rate of domestic inflation will actually only affect like the domestic part of the, like, we are buying domestic goods, then it will actually result in inflow more than outflow, rather than outflow more than inflow. So the best answer here would be B, because you demand for more imports, so your money will now will result in a higher outflow than your inflow. All right. And then 26, since 2000, the country's export prices have increased on average by 50% and its import prices by 25. What is the current figure for the country's terms of trade? At this moment in 2000, that will be 100, but what is the current figure? So now you can see that the export prices have increased by 50%, import prices by 25%, which means that our terms of trade has actually become better. So 75 and 83 is wrong, because if let's say the terms of trade is less than 100, that means your import prices are actually higher than your export prices. So it's either C or D. But then you can see that here the export prices have increased by 50%. So that will be like, if this increased by 50%, that will be, instead of 100, that will be 150 for your export prices, and then for import prices that will be 125. And then when you times 100, you'll get something like 150 divided by 125 times 100, you get 120. So answer is C. Okay, for question 27, each diagram shows the PPC of two economies, X and Y, which produce food and clothes. In which diagram will both economies benefit by specializing in the good which they have comparative advantage and trading at an exchange rate of 1 unit of clothes to 1.5 unit of food? So you can see from these four graphs, B is definitely wrong already, because the opportunity cost is the same for each product. For both the economies, it's 1-to-1 and 1-to-1. And then let's take a look at A. So I'm going to draw a line from 1 to the point on Y. And then I'm going to draw one line like this. So as you can see, this is clearly more than 1.5. So instead of 1 to 1.5, this is already like 1 to 2. So A is not correct. And I'm going to draw another line from 2 to the point on Y. And I'm going to draw a line like so. So you can see this one is close to 3. So this one is 2 to 3, which can also be defined as 1 to 1.5. So this one looks more accurate. And then for D, I'm going to draw from 2, somewhere around 2. I'm not sure if that's draw a bit further away. Something like this. So it's like 2 to 2. And so D is not correct, so the answer is C. Okay, 28. Which government policy is most likely to focus on an increase in the quantity of skilled labor? So this one means it's somewhere along the aggregate supply curve thingy. It's related to that. So anything that is demand side policy is definitely wrong. Okay, there's no such thing as exchange rate policy, so it's wrong. Fiscal policy is demand side policy. This one will either decrease or increase aggregate demand. So B is wrong. C is also wrong, so answer is D, because this is part of supply side policy. Okay, 29. A small trading country decides on a policy to import substitution by producing more goods and services itself rather than purchasing them from other countries. And what is the most likely reason for this? So this country probably only specializes in one thing, but now it's actually doing other things as well. So that means that it is not just producing one good, it's producing a lot of goods. So definitely there's no absolute advantage here. So A is wrong. And then for B, to influence world prices in international markets is not wrong. It's not correct, because now they are trying to produce more goods locally than to buy it from other countries. So they're not doing this to influence world prices in international markets, because they're just buying they are stopping basically their imports and then just producing it domestic. So it's mostly for domestic consumers. So B is not correct. And C, to protect local industries from foreign competition, that will be correct. But then let's look at D. To substitute imported technology for local labor is wrong, because if that's the case, right, your efficiency would reduce. So D is not correct. So answer is C. And for question 30, the monetary authorities of a country whose currency is floating freely raise the market rates of interest. Other things being equal, the exchange rate of a country is most likely to what? So now when you raise your rates of interest, your exchange rate will also increase. So A, B is wrong. So let's take a look at C and D. So C, it says rise as foreigners buy the domestic currency in order to hold assets with a higher yield. This one is correct, but let's take a look at D. So D, it says rise as exporters increase the volume of exports to hold foreign currency. No, because if you increase the volume of exports to hold foreign currency, you are essentially selling out your domestic currency, which will result in a decrease in exchange rate. So it's not correct. This is like the other way around. Instead, exporters would want to increase the volume of exports so that people will be buying it in the local currency, and then the exporters will hold more local currency. So D is wrong, and the answer is C. All right. So this is the end of this, specifically the specimen paper, and I hope this paper helps you out in economics, and I hope to see you again in the next video, which will be related to economics, computer science, or mathematics, and probably chapter discussions. And till then.